Chapter 21 of Trickery and Trust. Fluttershy's cottage was framed brilliantly by the Sunday morning sunlight, just as photogenic as it had been last night. Twilight sauntered on up to the modest home with a moderate pace, her draconic companion along for the ride tucked away in one of her saddlebags. Twilight needed information before she could confront Nox, lest she be victim to whatever memory-altering magic he had gotten his hooves on, and Fluttershy seemed like the perfect avenue for achieving this. The way the Pegasus had reacted to Nox's name in tandem with her midnight excursion into the Everfree, not to mention her Timberwolf-repelling tools, made her prime suspect number 2 in this investigation of hers. Knocking upon the door, Twilight waited for the Pegasus who dwelled within to answer. She wasn't left waiting for long before the homeowner answered, Fluttershy peeking out of the door with a disheveled mane and tired-looking eyes. The night had not been kind to her, whatever she had done in the woods being enough to wear her down considerably.
Oh, hello, Twilight. Not to be rude, but what are you doing here?
Fluttershy stepped to the side and gestured for her guest to enter, lack of sleep seemingly not doing much to deter her welcoming nature.
I thought you didn't have work until tomorrow. I don't, but I didn't have anything better to do today.
Twilight set her bags down next to the door, allowing Spike to crawl outward as the entrance was closed.
Never hurt to be a little social, and it was either you or Pinkie Pie. At least with you, I don't have to worry about Spike being seen. That's fair enough. You weren't busy or anything today, were you? I'd hate to intrude. Oh, no, nothing on the agenda today.
There was a nervous jitter to Fluttershy's words. Seemingly, she had been caught between actually having some plans and not wanting to be rude.
I just had a bit of a hectic night after you two left.
Guess I wasn't the only one who had some weird dreams. Spike stretched for a moment to regain his bearings before walking further into the house.
Yeah, you could say that.
Fluttershy made a shuddering, almost chuckling sound that conveyed just how apprehensive she really was right now.
I've got a few things I need to take care of upstairs. Feel free to help yourself to the coffee. There should be plenty. Even with Harry around?
Twilight jokingly asked.
He's already had his fill for the morning.
That was the last thing Fluttershy said before she ascended the staircase to attend to whatever it was that needed her attention, thus leaving Spike and Twilight to enter the kitchen and partake in the promised coffee. Well, that's why Twilight was going there anyway. Spike wasn't one for coffee, but he was one for getting a reminder on the plan.
So I just have to distract Harry for a while, right?
Spike whispered with great enthusiasm, ecstatic to just be involved.
That's the plan,
Twilight replied as she poured herself a mug of liquid hot goodness.
Just to keep him busy for a few hours while I talk to Fluttershy.
Spike's inclusion was a critical component in Twilight's plans for the day, if only to bolster the Long Dragon's mood and allow him to feel involved without putting him directly in harm's way. While leaving him to handle a bear wasn't exactly the safest of plans, Harry had proven to be docile to a fault, even when enraged over a game of chess. Not having to worry about a bear while discussing potentially sensitive information with Fluttershy was an added bonus Twilight was happy to have. So, in a way, Spike actually was helping out. So Twilight wasn't entirely lying to him. At least that's what she kept telling herself to keep the guilt at bay. But she was able to drown that guilt in piping hot, caffeinated goodness, enjoying this last moment of reprieve before her confrontation with the Yellow Pegasus. She found her eyes wandering about the room before they fell upon a pile of envelopes on the counter. Just the morning mail, nothing else out of the ordinary, and nothing that was Twilight's business. Though there was one open document that had caught her eye, one bearing the familiar crest of Equestria. Twilight had seen plenty of forms like these throughout her life. The bi-yearly pillar pulls. Every year, the Pillars of Equestria, the council of ponies who serve to assist and moderate the Queen's power, would be altered based on a public vote. Less desirable politicians would be booted out of office in favor of new recruits, and those who were deemed worthy would be allowed to continue their service. These forms were sent to every citizen in Equestria, and Twilight likely had one waiting in her mailbox back home. There was no harm in getting a sneak peek on who had their heads on the metaphorical chopping block, and who would be likely to continue their terms. Doubly so, seeing as how Fluttershy had yet to cast her votes.
Let's see who's up for renewal,
Twilight muttered aloud, taking the few sheets of government stationery in her magical grasp. The forms were divided up into 3 distinctive categories: those who were stepping down from their positions willingly, those who wished to be voted back into their office, and a list of new recruits who had proven themselves worthy to potentially be voted into office. The actual voting system was simple enough. Even a child could comprehend it. Up first was the list of ponies who would be stepping down from their positions. This section was usually absent in the forms that Twilight had seen in the past, but this year, it looked like there were actually a few ponies who were stepping down. 3 of 9, to be specific, though the only one that caught Twilight's eyes was the stallion known as Fancy Pants. Despite his admittedly funny name, this unicorn was one of the longest-standing members of the council, and Twilight was actually saddened by the announcement of his retirement. He had done wonders for Equestria's educational systems, and was someone Twilight was happy to have met a few times in the past. But it seemed over 20 years on the seat was enough for the old horse, and he was stepping down. A shame, really. Then there was the list of the current 6 members who wished to be voted back into office. Right next to each name were 2 labeled checkboxes. One read keep, while the other said kick. A simple enough voting system, which gave a fairly accurate idea of who the equestrian populace wanted to stay in office and who they wanted to kick out of office. 3 of the names in particular stood out to Twilight. The first 2 were those she was not a particular fan of. The twin unicorn brothers that were known as Flim and Flam, who had both been pillars for the past 5 years. How those 2 even met the criteria to be part of the council was something Twilight would never understand, and how they both kept being voted back into office was something the whole of Equestria would never comprehend. Public opinion of the 2 didn't seem to be very high, yet their 5-year streak spoke otherwise. The third name she took notice of, however, was what got Twilight to hesitate. Twilight Velvet looked to be trying to continue her 19-year term as a pillar of Equestria. It brought a smile to the young Alicorn's face to get this small confirmation that her mother was still alive and well, and just as invested in the nation's well-being as she had been when Twilight had left on her journey with Spike. This sudden sense of elation was almost enough to drive Twilight to go home and see her family again. But that idea was quickly filtered away, at least for the time being. Maybe she would consider the possibility again, once she was done with this mess here in Ponyville.
Well, I know who I'm voting for.
Twilight chuckled to herself as she placed the documents back on the kitchen counter. She didn't bother looking towards the list of possible new recruits, as she hadn't been involved in Equestria's affairs for a long time. The list of names would be absolutely meaningless to her. She'd probably just end up picking a few at random when she got home to fill out the form herself. An act that could potentially have consequences on the country as a whole, but the worst-case scenario was that the bad picks would only be around for a year.
All right, I've gotten everything taken care of,
Fluttershy quietly announced as she entered the kitchen. Far less tired and disheveled looking than she had been before she had gone upstairs, showing that at least some of her time had been spent making herself presentable.
So, was there anything you had in mind for today? I don't know about you two, but I think Harry wants to try his paw at chess again.
Spike chortled with glee as he strode out of the room in search of the coffee-addicted bear. Fluttershy made an attempt to try and stop him, but she was far too slow on the uptake, and the dragon was long gone by the time it mattered. And with that obstacle out of the way, Twilight was free to finally begin her little interrogation. She sat down at the table and waited for Fluttershy to do the same. After the Pegasus got her own coffee for the morning, of course. Fluttershy was one of the few ponies Twilight had met on her travels that she could call a friend, which made her hesitate at this moment, when she was finally going to begin the questioning. Alienating her wasn't exactly on the Alicorn's list of priorities, but there was no reasonable way she could bring herself to confront Nox without further information. If Fluttershy knew something, then Twilight needed to figure out what it was, for better or for worse.
So,
Twilight tapped the table with her hooves as she glanced around the room. Despite wanting to begin questioning her friend on the matter, she found herself tripping at the 1-yard line. Where was she even supposed to begin? All she had to go off of was an adverse reaction to Nox's name, a midnight excursion into the woods, and the small scraps of wood that could somehow repel Timberwolves. But Twilight would never have to make that choice. Instead, she was brought back to reality as the Yellow Pegasus let out a long and regretful-sounding sigh. She pushed her coffee to the side and rested her head on the kitchen table with her hooves over her head. A piece of body language used to convey a great deal of distress, one that Twilight remembered pretty clearly from her school days. The disguised Alicorn looked around the space for any assistance in this matter, but the only ones who could possibly offer some insight were currently busy partaking in a heated game of chess elsewhere in the cottage. And so Twilight was on her own here.
I can't do it anymore.
Fluttershy meekly moaned back.
I just can't keep doing this. Maybe this was a bad time.
Twilight couldn't help but wonder to herself. What she was looking at right now was a breakdown, plain and simple. Something was eating away at Fluttershy, and had been for what seemed to be a very long time now. Another thing that Twilight recognized from her own past that she could instantly empathize with. Twilight knew in that moment what had to be done, and all other plans and priorities were pushed aside to make room for the question she wished someone had asked her way back when.
Are you okay? Can you keep a secret?
Fluttershy's head tilted upwards, once more revealing her eyes to the purple pony. They were tired, practically on the verge of tears. But aside from that, there was a more subtle look hidden within those sapphire orbs. Hope. And despite the sincerity behind that question, Twilight couldn't help but chuckle a bit. Oh, if only Fluttershy knew.
I mean, I think I've done a pretty good job with Spike.
Twilight gestured to the exit that Spike had taken, just as the sounds of the dragon taunting Harry in jest could be heard emanating from elsewhere in the home.
Something on your mind? I shouldn't tell you.
Some doubt made its way into Fluttershy's tone, breaking eye contact and instead gazing into the dark-colored liquid within her brightly colored mug.
It's not that... Is this about Nox? No!
Just like that, Doubt was overcome by shock, Fluttershy nearly leaping out of her chair as her eyes went wide as the moon. And as suddenly as the sudden surprise had come, it also went, replaced by the usual meek tone the Pegasus spoke with. Her pink mane fell in such a way to partially hide her face from view.
No, it doesn't have anything to do with... him.
She shuddered at even this indirect reference to the town's lone Saurosian resident. To say that this reminded Twilight of Applejack's unease towards the memory magic that had been cast upon Rarity, and most of the town, if the farmer's hunch was correct, was an understatement.
Are you sure? Because you wouldn't be the only one bothered by whatever it is he's up to. I've seen his little security measure, we'll call it.
Twilight leaned forward in her seat, gazing at Fluttershy with a stern expression.
How ponies just forget things whenever some pony mentions the library's third floor. I don't blame you for not wanting to talk about it.
There wasn't an immediate response. Only a deafening silence that overtook the conversation. A maelstrom of thoughts was probably going through Fluttershy's head, and a variety of emotions made themselves known on her face. Confusion, uncertainty, realization, elation, fear, all of these and more were present in this moment.
I'm not the only one who knows about that?
There was evidence of relief in Fluttershy's voice, and even a small chuckle passed her lips.
I'm not the only one who knows.
It was clear that a great burden had just been lifted off of her back.
I'm not the only one.
Twilight smiled at seeing her friend's mood improve from this news, as well as the apparent evidence that she wasn't in league with the librarian. Or she was just a very good actor, Twilight's cynical side bravely suggested, before being silenced. Fluttershy had done very little, if anything thus far, to give Twilight a reason to distrust her. And thus Twilight felt obligated to not try and find reasons, especially since they might not even be there. Thus, she continued her explanation.
I'm not sure how believable this may sound, but I'm trying to put a stop to whatever it is he's up to.
She paused for a moment, taking the time to note Fluttershy's appearance. Even with that weight lifted off of her, she still seemed to be bothered by something, and it showed subtly in her expression. Judging by how this conversation had started in the first place, Twilight had the sneaking suspicion that it really didn't have anything to do with Nox's machinations. So in that case, surely it must have had something to do with whatever errand had dragged Fluttershy into the Everfree last night. A question that still prodded at the Alicorn's curiosity ever so tauntingly. She was already going out of her way to look into Nox's activities on Applejack's behalf. What harm was there in helping out a friend on top of that?
And if you help me out with this, then maybe I can repay the favor? Help you out with whatever it is that you've been lying about.
A cheesy and nervous grin stretched over Twilight's lips as she shrugged, hoping that Fluttershy would take the bait. Again, the conversation was stalled as Fluttershy pondered the offer. It was a much more logical-looking procedure when compared to the previous lull in the discussion, but there was still serious weight being tossed around here. And as the seconds dragged on, Twilight found herself on the verge of begging for the answer out of sheer anticipation. But just before she was about to reach that breaking point, Fluttershy broke the silence.
You can keep a secret, right? You already know the answer. No, I really don't. I know Spike is really important to you, but this is something really, really big. Bigger than both of us, and it...
Fluttershy lightly bit down on her lip as she paused, a nervous hum escaping her throat.
It might not be legal. Like, at all. I mean, harboring a dragon the way I have been isn't exactly legal either.
Or at least it wouldn't have been, if Queen Celestia wasn't aware of his existence. But Twilight felt like that was a tidbit better left for another time, when this whole mess was over and done with.
How bad can it possibly? The Timberwolves are trying to escape the Everfree Forest. If they get out, they'd be able to regenerate and reproduce using any piece of wood they get near.
Fluttershy interrupted, talking fast enough to make Pinkie Pie's head spin in disorientation.
They'd end up hurting and killing a lot of people and animals if that ever happens. And the only one who can stop them is an illegal immigrant who I've been helping live illegally out in the woods so she can work on putting a stop to them before anyone dies a horrible, horrible death.
The Pegasus sharply inhaled to replace her deprived oxygen stores that her little rant had thoroughly depleted. Afterward, she transitioned into slow and haggard deep breaths. Clearly, she was not as attuned to that kind of speed-talking as Pinkie Pie was. Not that Twilight was complaining about the conversation being delayed this time. In fact, the opposite was true. She needed to take a minute to try and parse the sheer amount of information that had just been dropped on her like a ton of bricks. She didn't exactly have many theories on what Fluttershy was doing. There just hadn't been the time to consider any. But this was not what she had been expecting.
Finally got it off my chest.
Fluttershy sighed, her exhausted demeanor shifting to one of long overdue satisfaction.
I'm feeling better already. Okay. Not what I was expecting.
Twilight murmured back, still dumbfounded by the confession.
But at least it explains the sticks. Yeah, my friend made them too.
Fluttershy stopped herself and squinted at Twilight with great skepticism.
Wait, what sticks? The ones in your backyard.
Twilight hesitantly replied.
I might have gotten a little too curious for my own good last night.
Well, that was certainly a way of summarizing the way Twilight had spent her evening.
And I might have broken one by mistake.
She quickly retrieved her saddlebags and produced the broken fragment of twig that she had acquired last night, presenting it to Fluttershy like a child who'd been caught in the cookie jar. Once again, Fluttershy halted the conversation as she stared at the broken yet still functioning ward. This pause wasn't nearly as long as the others, but it was just as telling as to what she was thinking. Based on her expressions alone, there was a brief moment of betrayal and hurt from this revelation, but it did not last as long as it probably should have.
I suppose that's fair. I was acting a bit suspicious, wasn't I?
Fluttershy found herself chuckling at her own expense, gently picking up the twig and casually examining it.
At least you didn't go around telling anyone about it, right?
She looked back to Twilight with a dead serious grimace.
Right? Spike doesn't even know.
Twilight quickly reassured, hoping that it would get the Pegasus to stop glaring at her with murderous intent.
Spike doesn't even know what?
The Long Dragon's question immediately drew the attention of the two ponies, both of them donning the embarrassed looks of children caught sneaking treats before dinner. Spike, meanwhile, was standing there with a puzzled look and a cocked brow. Twilight could tell he wasn't entirely aware of what was being discussed, but was ready to do anything to find out.
Are you keeping secrets from me? All you had to do was play chess with a bear for a while. How hard is that? No, Spike.
Twilight slowly answered and stood up from the table, placing her saddlebags firmly upon her back.
In fact, I was just coming to get you. We're going into the Everfree.
We are? Spike and Fluttershy both asked the exact same question at the exact same time, though with different inflections. Spike seemed more confused as to why they'd be going back out there, while Fluttershy seemed to be more nervous about the sudden venture into the woods.
Yes, we are.
Twilight told Spike before turning her attention to Fluttershy.
You said you'd help me if I helped you, right? Well, yes, I guess I did.
Fluttershy stammered, standing up in turn and making an effort to show her concern upon her face.
But right now? Your problem seems pretty urgent. Would you rather we wait? I suppose not. But you're going to bring him?
Fluttershy meekly pointed to Spike.
Not to be rude, but the last time we went in there, he got hurt because we were separated.
Twilight interrupted matter-of-factly.
That won't happen again. Especially since we'll have a bit of added protection this time around.
She gestured to the broken twig on the table. The confidence she was exuding was all for show. Bringing Spike back in there was not something she was eager to do. But if given the choice between leaving him unsupervised or letting him tag along, the latter was the more appealing option. Especially after she had already told Spike that he could help. She would never hear the end of it if she were to go back on that promise now. And so as the three of them prepared to depart into the woods, Twilight hid a groan of discontent. She had come here looking for information regarding her current predicament, and now she was leaving with the intent of solving a completely different problem. Not exactly how she had planned this procedure, but she's the one who offered to help in the first place, she reminded herself. Again. But before leaving, the disguised Alicorn took the time to reassure herself that it was going to be fine and worth it. After all, this is going to be beneficial to both parties. She was offering to help in exchange for the information she wanted in the first place.
Is this becoming a habit?
Twilight asked herself, standing by while Fluttershy retrieved her personal piece of Timberwolf protection.
I mean, helping people out like this isn't the worst thing in the world, I suppose.
And as the trio made their way out the back door, Twilight actually found herself wearing a smile. If only because, if nothing else, she knew what she could do once she and Spike were back on the road once all of this was said and done. But of course, the problems at Hoof needed to be solved first. And it seemed that the Timberwolves were the first ones on the chopping block.